At 7:23 a.m. on July 18, 1944, Corporal Henry Collins crouched beside a Sherman tank near the Orne River in Normandy. The vehicle was old, dented, and half covered in dried mud. A hairline crack ran along its right armor plate, the kind of flaw that killed crews in seconds. Collins, once a farmer in Ohio, pressed a strip of wire mesh against the steel, listening to the hollow echo inside. On the ridge beyond, German guns were adjusting range. He had only one morning left to try something no manual ever mentioned, a farm trick to keep men alive. The Sherman T-245 was the pride of no one. Its bogie suspension had worn uneven after weeks in Normandy mud, shifting weight to the right side, where armor was already thinned by factory limits. At high speed the tank shuddered, shaking bolts loose and cracking welds. On paper it was still operational, a word that meant nothing to the men inside. Collins knew what that vibration meant. He had seen 3 tanks die from the same flaw, their hulls splitting under impact before fire consumed them. Reports called it pilot error. The manuals said it was within tolerance. But tolerance, he thought, was just the space between regulation and a coffin. 3 tanks from his platoon had already burned that week. One vanished in a flash when a Panzerfaust struck the side plate. Collins heard the call on the radio, a voice shouting, "Hit on the right side. We're burning," then silence. He arrived minutes later to find only molten steel and a helmet half buried in soil. The same weak seam, the same fracture spreading from the lower hull. He kept samples of metal in his kit, comparing each break like a doctor studying wounds. The pattern never changed. It wasn't bad aim. It was bad design. And still the factory reports came back clean, stamped, within specification. Inside the tank's shadowed hull, Collins tapped the inner wall with a wrench. The sound was hollow, a tired echo. He could feel the vibration through his fingers, not strength, but fatigue. When he pressed a sheet of scrap mesh against the surface, the tone shifted lower, denser. That was the clue. The steel was failing not from heat or thickness, but from resonance, the same rhythmic stress he once heard in plow frames back home. His father used to wrap wire mesh around tractor arms to keep them from cracking on rough soil. That memory struck him harder than the artillery thunder outside. If it worked on a plow, maybe it could save a tank. The next morning Collins wrote his 4th maintenance request. The reply came back the same as before, unauthorized modification. Await factory inspection. The factory was in Detroit, 4,000 miles away. The battlefield could not wait for paperwork. He went to the command tent, still holding the report. The senior technician, Lieutenant Marshall, barely looked up. "Collins, the tank is in tolerance. Replace what's broken, not what's designed." Collins tried once more. "Sir, the side armor hums under stress. It's going to split when it takes a hit." Marshall sighed. "Then hope it doesn't take one." Next file. Outside, the wind carried the sound of artillery. Collins folded the report, slipped it into his pocket, and walked back toward the tank line. Every Sherman around him bore scars, cracks sealed with mud, dents hammered flat. He felt like a farmer standing in a field of dying machines, each one sick from the same disease. He crawled under T-245 and stared at the broken suspension joint. The welds shimmered faintly, metal strained from motion. He remembered the farm in Ohio, the smell of hot iron, his father's voice saying, "Steel remembers every blow you give it." Maybe the army forgot that. He hadn't. Near the workshop pile lay rolls of wire mesh used for fences, half buried in dirt. He lifted one, coarse, rusty, heavy. It was the same texture he'd used on tractor frames to stop vibration. The pattern of interlocked steel spread force across every line, the way wheat stalks share the wind. He thought of it as armor that breathes. That evening he drew a rough sketch in his notebook, a side plate wrapped with mesh, bound by tension wires every 6 inches. It wouldn't stop a shell, but it could disrupt the shock wave, break the vibration that tore the welds. He ran the numbers on stress load, rough estimates, Nothing official. The math looked impossible. The idea looked right. At dusk, he visited the supply shed. The corporal on guard looked up from a deck of cards. Need something? Just scrap, Collins said. The guard shrugged. Take what you want. Nobody signs for trash. Collins rolled the mesh out behind his tank. The sun had dropped, and the sky glowed faint orange over the hedgerows. He cut the wire with pliers, shaping it to fit the curve of the hull. Sparks jumped as he worked by lantern light. Sweat and grime mixed on his hands. The metal scent thick in the air. He fastened the first sheet to the right flank, looping wire around the fenders, twisting it tight until the mesh clung like a second skin. The pattern caught the last light, turning the tank into something almost organic, a creature covered in scales. He added a second layer over the weak suspension housing, then reinforced it with strips of old track links. By midnight his hands were bleeding. Each twist of wire cut deeper, but he didn't stop. He tested the tension by striking the mesh with a wrench. The note was dull now, not the bright hollow tone of failing steel. Good. When Lieutenant Marshall made his rounds near dawn, Collins was wiping oil from his fingers. The officer glanced at the tank. What's that on the side? Just patching a crack, sir. Used scrap wire to hold the paint. Marshall frowned, but moved on. Nobody cared about details when the front was moving east. Collins sat on the ground, staring at the finished work. The tank looked ugly, asymmetrical, rough, covered in wire and mud. But to him, it looked alive again. The design manuals would call it nonsense. A farmer would call it common sense. He whispered to the machine, "You'll hold this time. You have to." When the order came at dawn to advance toward Villers-Bocage, Collins climbed onto the rear deck, feeling the vibration through his boots. The hum was different, muted, controlled, steady. For the first time in weeks, the sound did not scare him. That night, rain fell in thin, steady lines across the fields. The camp was half asleep, engines cooling, radios silent except for static. Collins waited until the guards passed the motor pool before slipping from his tent. He carried a small toolbox, a lantern wrapped in cloth, and a roll of spare wire he had hidden under his bunk. He crouched beside the Sherman, the metal surface slick with rainwater. The tank looked larger in darkness, like a beast asleep. He crawled beneath the hull, where the ground was cold and smelled of oil. Each move of the wrench echoed faintly against the belly of steel. The mesh he had fitted earlier was just the beginning. Tonight he planned to bind the entire right side, a full reinforcement pattern from the idler wheel to the turret ring. He started with the lowest bracket, feeding the wire through gaps in the bogie mounts. His fingers trembled in the cold. Each twist of the pliers made a small, clean click. Time disappeared. The rain turned heavier. The wire cut into his palms until small streaks of blood ran with the water. He tied the ends tighter, ignoring the sting. The lantern's light threw shadows across the tank's rough surface, wire lines crossing like veins. He checked the tension by striking it with the handle of a screwdriver. The sound was solid, deep, alive. In the silence between thunder, he could almost hear the tank breathe. A voice startled him. "Collins, what the hell are you doing?" Private Dawson, the loader, stood in the rain holding a mug. "Just securing the side plate," Collins said. Dawson squinted. "You're wiring it shut?" "It's insurance. Farmer's method." "Farmers? We're not plowing fields." Collins gave a dry smile. "Same principle. Metal under stress is like soil under wind. You brace it, it holds." Dawson shook his head, but said nothing more. When he left, Collins went back to work. By 3 a.m, the right flank of T-245 was wrapped completely in mesh and cable. He stepped back to look. The rain softened its outline until it resembled an animal in armor. Exhaust pipes steamed gently, as if the tank were breathing through its scars. He gathered his tools and buried the leftover mesh under the mud. No one must know. Unauthorized modifications meant court-martial. But so did doing nothing and watching men burn. When dawn crept over the hedgerows, the the tank line stirred awake. Engines coughed to life, one after another. Collins wiped his hands and joined the crew as if nothing had happened. Inside the hull, he listened carefully. The vibration that used to rattle his teeth was gone. The mesh absorbed the tremor. The steel felt heavier, more grounded. The driver, Simmons, noticed it too. "Feels smoother," he said. "Did you grease the joints?" "Something like that," Collins replied. At first light, the order came, "Move toward Villers-Bocage." Collins climbed onto the rear deck, heart pounding as engines roared around him. Tanks rolled forward, tearing grooves into the wet soil. He watched T-245 move ahead, its wired armor glistening under the pale sun. From a distance, no one would see the difference. Up close, it was a rebellion disguised as repair. As the column advanced, Collins thought of his father again, the old man standing beside a tractor, saying, "Fix what breaks, even if the rules say it can't be fixed." Collins smiled faintly. "I fixed it, Dad," he whispered. When they reached the edge of the village, artillery opened up. He felt the first shell land somewhere ahead, a sharp concussion that shook the air. The tank's armor vibrated but stayed steady. Collins gripped the hull. The wire held. In that moment, under fire, soaked in rain and sweat, he realized he had done something forbidden and absolutely right. By noon, the rain had stopped. The sky over Villers-Bocage hung low and gray, heavy with gun smoke. Collins rode on the rear deck of T-245, feeling each vibration through his boots as the tank crawled forward across the open field. The hedgerows ahead hid German infantry armed with Panzerfausts. The smell of wet earth mixed with fuel, an odor every mechanic knew too well, the smell that came before fire. The radio crackled. "All Sherman's advance. Keep intervals." The driver throttled up. Collins steadied himself, eyes fixed on the right side of the hull where his wire mesh gleamed faintly beneath the mud. He knew this was it, the test no manual would ever approve. The first hit came sudden and brutal. A dull thud, not the deafening crack he expected. The tank rocked, but kept moving. Inside, the crew shouted, "Hit on the right side." Collins jumped off the deck, dropped to the ground, and looked. Smoke curled from a dent the size of a fist, but the armor hadn't pierced. The mesh was torn, the wires stretched but intact. Another impact followed, harder this time. Then another. Each one made the tank lurch, but not stop. Shards of dirt flew from the ground as explosions echoed through the valley. The air was thick with dust and smoke. Collins ducked beside the tread, heart pounding, waiting for the inevitable burst of flame, but it never came. Inside the intercom, the gunner's voice was half disbelief, half laughter. "She's still running. She's still." The next shell hit the turret ring. Metal screamed, but the breach held. When the firing ceased, the Sherman rolled into cover behind a hedgerow. Collins climbed up again, hands trembling. He counted the marks. 1, 2, 5. By the end, 14 distinct impacts along the right side. None had gone through. The mesh looked shredded, twisted into strange shapes, but it had absorbed the shock. He touched the steel. Warm, vibrating softly, alive. The commander, Lieutenant Reed, leaned from the hatch, face black with soot. "Collins, what the hell did you do to my tank?" "Just fixed her up, sir." Reed stared at the wired armor, then back at him. "Whatever you did, do it to every tank we've got." Collins said nothing. Orders like that could end his career. But the lieutenant was already turning the turret, scanning for targets. They pressed forward again, through smoke and rubble. Panzerfaust teams scattered under machine gun fire. One German soldier dropped his launcher and ran, glancing back at the American tank that refused to die. When the shooting stopped, the crew climbed out to inspect the damage. The driver whistled low. 14 hits, not one penetration. Collins knelt to examine the largest dent. Beneath the twisted mesh, the armor showed fine spiderweb cracks that would have spread if not for the wire tension. The crude reinforcement had distributed every impact, saving the hull from breaking. He didn't celebrate. He simply wiped the grime from the steel and murmured, "You held." The lieutenant radioed in the victory. Command chalked it up to luck. They always did. That evening, as the sun sank behind blackened trees, Collins sat beside the tank. The wire mesh flickered in the fading light like a net of old scars. In the distance, other Shermans burned, unlucky ones without his patchwork armor. He thought again of the farm in Ohio, the clang of a plow, the steady rhythm of fixing what men broke. War had turned that lesson into survival. For the first time since Sicily, Collins allowed himself to breathe without fear. He had defied the system, and the system had lost. Word traveled faster than orders. Within days, every mechanic in the battalion had heard the rumor. A broken Sherman that took 14 hits and kept moving. No one knew how. The men only said the armor sang different, that it rattled like wire before each shot. At the motor pool, Collins worked quietly, replacing a bogey wheel when a corporal approached. "Hey, Collins. Heard your tank's got angel armor." Collins didn't look up. "It's just luck. Luck doesn't stop Panzerfausts." He shrugged. Then maybe it was bad aim. But inside, he felt the weight of what he'd done, and what it could mean if others copied it. That night, 2 mechanics came to him with scraps of mesh fencing. "Show us how you did it," one whispered. He hesitated. "You didn't hear it from me." By dawn, 3 more tanks had thin wire layers hidden under mud and spare track links. The modification spread like a quiet rebellion, a language spoken in steel and silence. No paperwork, no signatures. Every patch job disguised as field repair. When inspectors came through, the wire came off before sunrise, buried under crates, then returned once they left. A week later, combat reports showed an anomaly. Casualty rates in certain armored units had dropped by a third. Command noted the numbers, but credited terrain advantage. Nobody asked the mechanics why the same weak Shermans were suddenly lasting longer. Collins received a summons to the technical office. Lieutenant Marshall held up a photo of T-245. "Explain this mesh pattern. It's showing up across the regiment." Collins kept his eyes level. "Improvised mudguards, sir. Keeps debris off the suspension." Marshall frowned. "You expect me to believe half the unit suddenly decided to care about mud?" Collins said nothing. The lieutenant sighed. "If it works, keep it quiet. We don't need another unauthorized miracle." Outside, Collins exhaled slowly. He realized something powerful had begun, not a rebellion, but an evolution. Mechanics across Normandy were solving what engineers in Detroit couldn't. How to make thin steel live longer than doctrine allowed. At night, the motor pool glowed with hidden lamps. Sparks flashed under tarps. The rhythm of hammer and plier replaced sleep. Every clang was an act of quiet defiance. In one corner, a young corporal asked, "What do we call this thing?" An older sergeant replied, "Farm armor." The name stuck. The changes reached other regiments. British crews near can reported Sherman tanks surviving multiple direct hits. Some claimed the Americans were using a secret new armor alloy. German intelligence intercepted those reports and filed them under possible material improvement. No one guessed the truth, that it was wire, sweat, and faith holding the machines together. One evening, a supply officer noticed half a roll of fence mesh missing from storage. He filed a report. 2 days later, the paperwork vanished from the queue. Someone higher up had buried it. Collins continued his routine as if nothing had changed. He cleaned oil filters, tuned engines, filed bolts. But whenever a new tank arrived, he walked around it slowly, tapping the side plates, listening. Mechanics nearby would catch the rhythm and join in, the strange ritual of men who understood steel through sound. By late August, whispers spread that the wire trick had reached another division. No one could trace its origin. Collins was both proud and afraid. Pride, because it worked. Fear, because ideas could die faster than men if the wrong officer found out. When headquarters sent an engineering team to audit the field modifications, Collins stayed silent. The morning they arrived, every mesh-covered tank rolled out early for road testing. The team saw nothing unusual. By afternoon, the Shermans returned, mud-caked and unremarkable. As night fell, Collins walked past the line of tanks. Under their grime, he could still see faint outlines of mesh and wire, the fingerprints of every man who had believed in a farmer's logic more than factory orders. He realized the change had escaped his control. It was no longer his secret. It belonged to the war now. The next morning, one of the drivers handed him a cigarette and said, "They say you started this." Collins lit it, smoke curling through the chill air. "Then they're wrong," he said. "It started in a field in Ohio." The driver frowned. "Never heard of that battle." Collins smiled faintly. "You wouldn't. No one ever fought there." He watched the sunrise glint off the wire-wrapped tanks and thought, maybe that was enough. Maybe survival didn't need permission, only persistence. On the German side of the front, confusion turned into suspicion. Reports from panzer divisions described American Shermans that refused to burn. Armor-piercing rounds ricocheted or buried themselves shallowly before detonating. Commanders demanded explanations. The first assumption was that the Allies had introduced a new kind of armor plating, perhaps hardened steel or a secret British alloy. Engineers were ordered to collect fragments and study them. What they found only deepened the mystery. A lieutenant from the 12th SS Panzer wrote in his log, "Our shells deform upon impact, but penetration is inconsistent. Some Shermans seem immune to side hits. Their hulls carry strange patterns, like wire or mesh under mud. Unknown device. Investigate." At a workshop outside Falaise, captured American wrecks were examined. Technicians scraped away layers of soil and found thin traces of twisted wire embedded in the armor joints. The fragments made no sense to them. Too crude, too random. Berlin dismissed the finding as field debris. The front line, however, kept losing tanks to these lucky Shermans. Inside his camp, Collins heard the rumors from intercepted radio chatter. "They think we've got new armor," said Dawson, half laughing. Collins didn't respond. He was fixing a trackpad, listening to the metallic heartbeat under his hands. He thought of how the Germans were trying to explain a miracle built out of fence wire. The new confidence among the crews was unmistakable. Men who once flinched at every whistle of incoming fire now joked as they loaded shells. If Collins's tank can take 14 hits, maybe ours can take 15. The phrase became a kind of superstition, the 15th shell rule. Mechanics began tightening their wires by counting turns, measuring with the same care they once gave to barrel alignment. Combat footage later showed Shermans rolling through villages under direct fire, shrouded in dust, their sides glinting with the faint pattern of mesh. German gunners grew frustrated. Some claimed their weapons were malfunctioning. Others began aiming for the turret instead of the hull. The battlefield dynamic had changed. At a captured outpost, an SS sergeant told his interrogators, "The Americans have found something. Their tanks do not die right. They absorb the hit, like cloth instead of iron." When asked to elaborate, he said simply, "It is unnatural." Across the Atlantic, American ordnance officers also began to notice the pattern. Field reports from multiple divisions described unexpected resistance to shaped charges. One memorandum listed it as a localized reinforcement anomaly. The official explanation blamed mud buildup. No one mentioned wire. The truth was too absurd for bureaucracy. Collins was summoned again by Lieutenant Marshall. "Headquarters wants to know what's happening out there," the officer said. "Enemy thinks we have magic armor. I told them we just maintain better." Collins nodded. "That's true, sir. We do." Marshall narrowed his eyes. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. But don't let anyone write it down." That night, Collins sat beside T-245. The tank bore new scars, 7 more dents from the last engagement. He traced the grooves with his hand. Each one was a memory, each vibration a heartbeat that hadn't stopped. The Germans, unable to explain it, began modifying their tactics. They increased use of high-angle fire, trying to strike Shermans from above. They issued new armor-piercing rounds with stronger fuses. Still, the effect was uneven. The mesh distributed force unpredictably, making even a weak tank behave like a phantom. By September, rumors reached Berlin that the Americans were testing reactive armor. Scientists debated impossible designs. Some even theorized electromagnetic shields. In truth, the shield was a farmer's fence wrapped by a tired mechanic who refused to lose another crew. The shift in morale was unmistakable. For the first time, Allied tankers felt the psychological edge. They no longer whispered about Ronsons, the grim nickname for Shermans that lit up every time. Instead, they called their tanks mules, stubborn and hard to kill. In one battle near Falaise, a German captain watched through binoculars as 3 Shermans took repeated hits and kept advancing. He turned to his gunner. "Why do they not stop?" The gunner answered, "Perhaps they are already dead." That phrase would later appear in a German field diary as a note of despair. The Wehrmacht, so used to outgunning Allied armor, now faced machines that disobeyed logic. Every shell that failed to penetrate eroded confidence more than steel. Collins never saw that diary. He never needed to. He saw the confusion in the way enemy fire hesitated, in the split seconds before the next shell. He had turned fear into hesitation, a tactical advantage more powerful than armor itself. When the unit finally rotated off the line, their commander gathered the crews. "We lost fewer tanks this month than any since Sicily," he said. "Whatever's keeping you alive, keep it up." The men laughed and clapped each other on the back. No one mentioned the wires. Collins walked away before the applause ended. He didn't want medals. He wanted silence. As the sun sank, he looked at the horizon glowing red from artillery beyond Cannes. The air smelled of burnt steel and wheat, the same mixture as harvest days back home. He realized the war was beginning to forget him even before it ended. But that was fine. Let history chase its own myths. The truth would stay hidden under mud, wrapped around bolts and welds, in the quiet rhythm of survival. When the fighting in Normandy finally eased, reports of improved survivability reached Allied headquarters in London. Charts showed declining armor losses, but no one could explain why. Engineers assumed it was terrain, tactics, or luck. None of the memoranda mentioned fence wire. Collins was ordered back to England for reassignment. His transfer papers described him simply as maintenance, armored vehicle section. No commendation, no citation. Lieutenant Marshall shook his hand before he left. "You did good work, Corporal. Just remember, the Army doesn't decorate common sense." He nodded, understanding what that meant. Innovation without authorization didn't belong in the official record. At the docks, as he boarded the transport, Collins looked back at the line of tanks waiting for shipment. Some bore the faint imprint of mesh under their dried mud. Mechanics had kept the trick alive. He smiled, knowing the secret would outlive the paperwork. In England, he was stationed at a repair depot near Southampton. Rows of damaged Shermans arrived daily, some burned out, some intact, but trembling from impact fatigue. He could tell by sound which ones had the mesh treatment. The hum was different, lower, steadier. New officers from the Ordnance Department came through for inspections. One of them carried a clipboard marked Project Spaced Armor. They talked of layered deflection systems and non-rigid impact damping. Collins listened silently as they described his invention in perfect technical jargon, without once mentioning his name. He asked one engineer, "Where did that idea start?" The man replied, "Probably Lockheed. Maybe Aberdeen Proving Ground. Nobody really knows. Some field experiment, I suppose." Collins only said, "Yes, sir. Probably." By winter, his orders came to return home. Discharge for mechanical fatigue. Years of crawling under tanks had taken their toll. He didn't argue. Back in Ohio, the war ended in newspaper headlines and parades he didn't attend. He bought back his father's small farm, repaired the tractor that still stood in the barn, and hung his uniform in a corner of the workshop. Neighbors called him the mechanic soldier. He fixed their equipment, tuned engines, welded tools. His hands carried the smell of oil until they trembled with age. When people asked about the war, he shrugged. I kept machines running. That's all. Once, a traveling veteran stopped by for repairs. The man noticed the framed photograph on the wall, a Sherman tank half covered in wire, soldiers posing proudly beside it. You were there? The veteran asked. Collins wiped grease from his palms. Yeah, Normandy. What was with the wire? Collins smiled faintly. Just a farm trick. Worked better than it should have. The visitor laughed. You know, they use that method now. It's called layered armor. Saved my cousin in Korea. Collins said nothing, only nodded. He knew recognition didn't matter. The real victory was survival, and the idea that a bit of rural logic had rewritten the limits of military engineering. At night, he often sat alone in the barn, listening to rain strike the tin roof, the same rhythm as shrapnel on steel. Sometimes he would rest his hand on the tractor frame and feel its hum. The same vibration he once tamed on a battlefield. The local paper printed a small notice when he died. Henry Collins, war veteran and mechanic, passed peacefully at his home, survived by his wife and 2 children. No mention of the tank. No mention of the 14 hits. But in the records of the Ordnance Department, a footnote appeared under a 1945 technical update. Field adaptation using flexible mesh reinforcement. Source, unverified. That was him. Unverified, unseen, indispensable. 20 years later, a young historian from the Army Research Institute tracked down veterans of the Normandy campaign. Among the photographs she found in an old storage box was one that puzzled her. A Sherman tank wrapped in wire, its hull pitted with deep scars. On the back, written in fading pencil, was a single line. T245, the one that wouldn't die. She followed the trail to a small farm in Ohio. The man who answered the door was in his 70s, his hands still marked with the thin white lines of old cuts. Collins invited her into the workshop. On the wall hung the same photo, framed in dust and sunlight. He told her little, just that the tank had taken 14 hits and kept moving. When she asked how, he smiled and said, because we stopped listening to rules and started listening to steel. She wrote his story in a quiet report, filed under Field Innovations by Maintenance Crews, 1944. It never reached print. But that file, decades later, helped design the composite spacing used in modern armored vehicles. After Collins died, his son kept the photograph and the notebook filled with rough sketches, wire patterns, tension notes, simple arithmetic about resonance and impact. None of it looked like genius. It looked like work. In military museums, the Sherman was often displayed as a symbol of mass production, the tank that won by numbers, not by brilliance. No plaque ever mentioned the man who made it survive longer than it should have. Yet his fingerprints remained, invisible, beneath every layer of reinforced hulls built since. One winter evening, long after the wars had ended, a group of tank mechanics training at Fort Knox watched an old film reel labeled Normandy armor test footage. They saw the battered Sherman rolling through smoke, its side glinting with strange wire mesh. Someone asked, who thought of that? The instructor paused, shrugged, and said, nobody. Somebody. And maybe that was right. History didn't need to remember the name Henry Collins. It only needed to remember that in the mud and fire of Normandy, a farmer's instinct outthought an army's doctrine. Because sometimes progress doesn't come from laboratories or generals. It comes from a tired man under a tank, bleeding, thinking of home, and refusing to let steel fail.